jumps out as you're not looking as closely, but I think collectively we could keep a closer eye on those notices when new courses are coming out, to make sure that we're, we're we're working to maintain our student body. And in this one particular case, the proposed instructor, this was not their area of research or necessarily area of expertise, other than the last few lectures in this class. So I think we felt pretty justified in contesting it. So we'll see how it turns out. But I think that's probably going to be a growing trend on the climate side of things. So we should make sure that we're watching out for that, but also just continuing to do a great job with our courses. Because I think our enrollment has been quite good. Okay. This is a fun one. Spaces. So I know there's a lot of words here. Those kind of, when I interviewed and met with, especially I would say, researchers, research staff, postdocs, I heard a lot about space, the condition of spaces, especially in soil science. So I've done tours, with folks from the dean's office. I've done tours with our department and seen some of these spaces, and now I kind of know what you're talking about. A little eek there. So soil science, and I've learned that the dean's office has their own, the college has their priority list, and then facilities has their priority list, and they don't always match up. Soil science is the top of our college's list. But it's also been given a stamp of do not resuscitate as well. And so they're not going to allow us to, try to do major renovations in soil science. So the process would be, they would identify another space where we would fit, where everything in soil science would fit. And then whoever's there currently, they would have to get moved out. So they're renovating one space to move some people out, and then they shuffle us in. So it's this whole kind of shuffling game, musical chairs, and hopefully we find a seat before when the music turns off. So it is a bit of a process, I know, and I do know there are proposals in the works for building all new facilities that our department could interact with or have some space, but those are all early stage things, and there's nothing that's I can be transparent with you. There's nothing that's very clear about this, other than it's at the top of the college's list, and it's in the top 3 of facilities list. For some of the new initiatives and things, I gave the example of MCAP and the AI climate program. MCAP is a ongoing program. Professor Heidi Roop is running, and then the AI climate program is it's a 5-year program that is has sort of a center approach to it, and we just don't have, for either of those programs, we don't have the space in Borlaug or soils to set up for that. So those people involved in those programs are working on acquiring other space around campus, which has its own issues we won't get into. But that's one way in which programs are trying to find new space. I can share that Carrie and Nicole continue to clean and update more student offices in Borlaug, and that's where we'll continue to do that as long as we have the budget for paint and carpet, things like that. But definitely keep us updated on where things are with space. We're not in your labs continually, and we mostly only hear when there's something major going on, or water coming into our classrooms. It's not raining today, but we have our jar in place over there. One cool thing, and I won't steal the thunder of the DEI committee, but they've been going around our public spaces in Borlaug and Soils and thinking about revisioning what we can do in those public spaces to kind of revamp advertising, collaborative spaces, but also in a way that shows who we are today and all the exciting things we're doing, but also preserves and shows some of that historical perspective on things as well. So I won't give more than that. I'll let the DEI committee at a future community meeting share some of what they've come up with for that. So, any questions here? Thoughts? Additions? Yeah.
I want to comment on public spaces for collaborative type research. John Baker and I were out in University of Utah several years ago, and they had a nice setup with couches and whiteboards in hallway spaces, which really sort of, fostered some collaborative type thinking. Yeah.
So examples of other places that have open public collaborative workspaces, whiteboards, couches like that. So I wasn't, other than visiting some colleagues in past years, I don't really know how the entrance to Borlaug was used before, if at all. I have noticed a lot more work happening there with some of the new furniture that's in place, and I think that's a good example of if you build it, it'll get used. So some of what the DI committee is looking at is thinking about these sort of things. How could we, there's one of the suggestions, for example, having some whiteboards and some workspace. So there's a couple of levels in Borlaug that has that. We may be able to identify more spaces as well, especially as we think about the ESPM program and building a home identity for those students. Having more spaces like that would be really critical. But also having, for our research groups and, researchers and grad students and stuff as well. So.
If you happen, I don't know if you happen to take pictures of that, but this is one of the ideas, especially that comes to the EI and this thing coming back to is like, places to, whiteboards or places that people can draw or doodle or like have shared space together.
Yeah. Putting simple things like putting cushions on hard surfaces so that students could, or whoever can hang out longer than a couple of minutes without being super uncomfortable. Less prison-like in general. I think that's a good starting point. We did pay a lot of money to take bars off of one of the office windows. I thought we have a lot of skill sets around. There would have been cheaper ways to get those bars off, but I know facilities has requirements. So I'm not going to say much about research because there's way too many projects going on across the department. But I will say, just in terms of from the college perspective, soil, water, and climate is always in the top 3, or at least the years that I've seen historically, top 3 in terms of sponsored project funding. And again, I already mentioned this, but there's such a wide variety of funding sources coming into our department to support our research. And I want to say that one of the most exciting parts of my job is to a couple times a day log in and look at proposals that are pending that are about to be submitted and get to read a little bit about the work that people are proposing. And it's really cool. Such a wide variety of work and some really fascinating projects that I'm getting to read about and learn about. I do think, one thing that Rachel and others in the office and I can think about is, and maybe historically that this happened more, and in the transition that hasn't happened as much, but thinking about a way to share with the whole soil, water, and climate community when new projects do come in. That's really exciting. I get to see those emails when projects come in. But I think that would be really cool for the rest of the department to get to see, like, oh, these are the projects, and it may just be a list or something initially, because the work hasn't been done yet. But when a project is funded, that's quite exciting, especially for the research group who got the funding, but it's also good to know what everybody else is doing across the department. There may be collaborations that you didn't realize somebody was working in a certain area, and knowing they have a new project coming in could spark conversation and influence the next proposal that goes out. So yeah, that's something that we'll be looking at and advertising back out. Okay, so that is the department side of things. My first semester, it was curriculum heavy, but it was just some brief updates, I guess. So for the rest of the time here, I'd like to talk a little bit about ways I've been thinking about interacting with the department on the research side of things. So my research area is quite broad, but it largely comes from the atmospheric perspective side of things. I had done a lot of instrumentation development, making various forms of mass spectrometers, things like this, that could go right out into the field and do measurements instead of bringing everything back to the lab. We did some lab work a little bit, but what I want to do in the future is more field work, and that's this department is great at field work. So I've been thinking about looking at all the projects that are going on in the department, thinking about how I could plug in a little bit more to that as well. And this, I'm not specifically proposing exact projects here, just kind of some of the areas of my interest. When I interviewed for this job, I didn't talk too much about my research, but over the coming years, I'll start to do some more research as well. And I'd like that research to not be just my research group sitting alone doing research. I want it to be everything be collaborative, and I'd be very excited to co-advise students and those types of things. So here's my summary of the bullet points. Probably the one I'm going to talk about most here is fire, a little bit about wind, this idea of environmental forensics, and then the last thing that I'll leave you with for a thought is this idea of having a shared mobile research facility platform that could be, could be here on campus, but it could go anywhere within its driving range to do interesting soil, water, and climate research. So I think one thing that I bring in to the department that's a little bit distinct from a lot of the atmospheric folks that are here is that I've really spent a lot of time thinking about the particles that are in the air. So I'm going to highlight a few reasons why particles in the atmosphere are important and what they can tell us about ecosystems, about biosphere atmosphere exchange, about what they do in the climate system, as examples. So any suspended liquid or solid that's in the atmosphere is technically called an aerosol. And I was telling a friend this one time, and he's like, so an airplane is an aerosol? There's some size part that has to be added to that definition, because it's mostly, when we talk about aerosols, we're talking about particles that are typically 10 micrometers or smaller in diameter. And the size actually matters a lot, how it impacts the climate system, how it impacts health, how long it can be in the atmosphere. So this is a simulated, it's actually a snapshot of a movie that shows aerosols in the atmosphere. But what this is highlighting is actually mostly a lot of what you're seeing here is skewed towards the larger particles, like the windblown dust coming off the Sahara and the Gobi, and transporting long distances in our atmosphere. You have sea spray. It ends up being a lot of salt particles, but there's organics in that sea spray as well. The greenish color is more of a biogenic that would be kind of a carbon-rich type aerosol, so that could be out of forests. But there's also a lot of anthropogenic. We dig up that old carbon as fossil fuels and burn it and put it in the atmosphere, so that those particles are also carbon-rich, although they're not natural to the atmosphere. The whitish color is highlighting kind of more of the sulfate aerosol type aerosol that is coming from a lot of like diesel combustion or coal combustion are main sources of sulfur aerosol in the atmosphere. But there are, there's lots of elemental composition to this dust and soil that gets suspended in the atmosphere. Looking here, actually a lot of the mineral, some of you probably know this, but for example, the Amazon forest gets a lot of its nutrient supply coming off of the Sahara dust that transfers cross-continental. So there's really interesting interactions that take place here through aerosol processes. As these particles are in the atmosphere, they're also interacting with sunlight, and they could be scattering light or absorbing light. So some particles warm the climate, some particles cool the climate. Also, you can't form a cloud without a particle. So if we had no particles in our atmosphere, we would have no clouds, and that would create a warmer globe for us. But also the types of particles and the number of particles will influence what type of clouds you form, what color the clouds are, how long those clouds live, where it rains or where it doesn't rain. That's all impacted by the particles, the sources of particles that are going up in the atmosphere. So precipitation patterns are greatly affected by particles. These particles come from a wide range of sources, as I already started talking about. There's an important differentiation between primary particles and secondary particles, as they're called. So primary particles are particles that are directed directly to the atmosphere as particles. Secondary particles are particles that were formed in the atmosphere from gas to particle condensation and growth of smaller particles. So secondary particle mass was emitted as a gas, and then something happened. It could have been reactive chemistry or number of things that could happen to convert those gases to particles in the atmosphere. And actually, for the particles that matter a lot for the climate system and for human health, a majority of that particle mass in the atmosphere is secondary in nature. So tracking where those particles came from in the first place, you have to understand where those gases came from, and you have to understand the chemistry that happened while it was in the atmosphere. And particles are all different sizes. The size and the chemical composition tells us about where the particle came from or what processes it might have been through in the atmosphere. So physical and chemical properties are all very important for different reasons. That leads to all those different physical and chemical properties of particles leads to different health impacts. For example, here you can see the different size particles. These are small particles of starting from like 10 nanometer out to 10 micrometers. These different size particles will impact in different parts of your airway. So the biggest particles are actually really good at impacting up in your upper airway. The smallest particles also start to act like gas molecules, and they diffuse so fast that they're also lost up in your upper airway. So it's this kind of medium-sized particle that gets deepest into your lungs. And so the composition and physical properties of those particles really matter a lot in terms of the health, because that's the only way out. Once you get that deep into your lungs, the only way out is through your bloodstream. So those chemicals are going to become a part of your body. So size matters for health impacts. Also, for similar reasons, those particles are also very impactful in the radiation balance of our planet and influencing light. A lot of environmental impacts, climate impacts are all determined based on where that particle came from, what it's made of, and what sizes they are. Like I mentioned, cloud formation. Some particles will be really bad at forming clouds. Like an oily particle is not going to condense water very well and not make a cloud. Other types of particles will be really, really efficient at forming clouds. So that's a lot of the health and climate side of things. There's a lot more that aerosol science does. And when I was at WashU, I had kind of different projects in a lot of these different areas. some in agriculture, some energy, medicine, materials, health. This is my main starting point with climate and the environment. But being here, I'm of course thinking a lot more about some of the agricultural uses for aerosols, but also ways of studying agricultural aerosols and agricultural systems. Okay. I'm gonna skip a few things. So this is just showing on the climate side of things. There are basically positive numbers here mean these are things contributing to warming our climate. Negative are cooling the climate. So greenhouse gases like CO2 and methane are warming the climate. Particles, some warm and some cool, but there's a net cooling effect of having particles in the atmosphere. That's globally, but it's also regionally as well. So when we have fires here in Minnesota, you know, there can be a cooling effect based on what those particles look like, and I'll talk about that a little bit. And then also adjustments to clouds based on what particles in the atmosphere tends to be a net cooling effect overall. So this is called the direct and indirect effect of aerosols in the climate system. And they're quite important for determining what the temperature of our planet's going to be, but also determining what regional temperatures are going to be and what regional rainfall is going to be as well. The particles will play a major role in that. Interest of time, I'm gonna, well, there's one, this is, yeah, I know I'm gonna go long. This is that same warming and then cooling, and these, they should have flipped the colors. These are cooling things here, so aerosol direct and indirect effects. There are these interesting blips over time, these spikes. These are actually, when you have volcanic eruptions, you can put reflective aerosol up into the stratosphere. And if you get aerosols in the stratosphere, they can actually stay there for a couple of years. All these aerosols down here are short-lived drivers close to the ground because they're only going to be in the atmosphere a couple of weeks at most, as they you know travel from one continent to the next, and then they'll be lost to wet and dry deposition. But if you get particles way up in the stratosphere, it can actually contribute to global cooling and also global dimming as well. So but the thing is, it's not like a greenhouse gas. It's not in the atmosphere for hundreds of years or thousands of years. It's just a couple of years. So you get these temporary cooling moments of cooling in because of aerosols, because the particles that are in the atmosphere. But it's ones that had a strong volcanic eruption that shot basically through the troposphere and shot particles up into the stratosphere and could cool temporarily. That's the whole basis for a lot of the geoengineering discussions that are taking place about if we had to drop the temperature of our planet in emergency, could we? Well, we could shoot a bunch of sulfate aerosol in the stratosphere, but you're also going to not have as much sunlight to grow food, which I think we need food. But it depends how dire our situation is. And then when that sulfate aerosol falls back to the surface, whether it's oceans or land, it acidifies those soils and those waters. So overall, not a great strategy. But there's really interesting history here in terms of if you go way back in time, you can time the downfall of some nations, whether it's just a random correlation or not. But a lot of the major famines have happened after a major volcanic eruption, for example. It's harder to grow food after that. Okay. That was my version of skipping this slide. So in a couple quick things on my past research related to fires. So I've done a fair amount of laboratory research on fires in controlled burn chambers, and I've done some field studies on fires, mostly working with agricultural controlled burns or forest controlled burns, where we would fly a drone over a forest fire, for example. So fires are fun. They're fun to study. The gas and particle emissions that come out of fires really depends on what you're burning, whether it's what type of plant it is, or if it's a tree or shrub or grasses, or what part of the tree is burning. They're all very different emissions. The stage of the fire really matters, whether it's the startup period or the later smoldering period, you get very different emissions of gases and particles. And here's just an example of some laboratory studies where we're looking at different stages of burn from oak wood that was compressed into pellets compared to apple wood. And you had a lot of early emissions of organics and inorganics for this fire, and a couple different phases of the fire for these compressed pellets. But the apple wood actually had much higher emissions later in the burn during the smoldering phase, which can also often happen as well out in the real world, where if the fire is going really well, it's you're maybe making a lot of CO2, CO and CO2, but not making as much for particles. But as soon as that fire starts to die down and starts to smolder a little bit, you can get a lot more particle production. I think those of you who sat around a campfire enough nights, you know these different stages of the fire quite well. The other thing with these fires that we've studied, so we did this is relevant for some of you in this department, that we've burned different types of Alaskan peat in the laboratory after drying the samples. So there are more and more peatland fires, and we're interested to study those aerosols coming out. And what we found in those studies was that the fresh emissions of those particles were quite absorptive, and they contributed to warming. So for the first few days of the particle's life in the atmosphere, it would contribute to warming our planet. But as it oxidized and aged in the atmosphere, you get sort of a photo bleaching effect, so that at some point after several days, these particles became highly reflective and contributed to cooling effects. So that makes it really complicated for us to model that, where the absorption and reflection properties are continually evolving as these particles evolve in the atmosphere. Particles tend to be one of the harder things to put into our current models, and mostly it's done in very simplified ways so far. Overall, it's still bad to have these particles up, even if they do become cooling at some point, because they were warming for a long time, causing regional warming. They're also detrimental to, in general, whether they look like this or this, they're detrimental to our health. And they also impact cloud formation and precipitation patterns. So we also have studied the ability for these particles, these different type of particles, to take up water vapor and form cloud droplets. And in aerosol science, we call that the hygroscopicity of particles. So as particles age, they tend to have higher and higher hygroscopicity. And it's a little bit different depending on what the source of the particles are. But this was an example using some of the biomass burning particles. This is a custom tool that we built to do this. It's called a tandem differential mobility analyzer, where we can scan the particle size before and after introducing it to different humidity environments, and see how good those particles are at taking up water and forming clouds. And yeah, what type of clouds form will actually change a lot of the precipitation properties of that cloud. So this is just a kind of an instructional example of what that looks like. Is, let's say you have a forest fire in Colorado, and a certain amount of water vapor in the air, and as that air mass lifts and cools, you're going to condense a fair amount of water on each of these particles, and it'll grow to a size large enough to rain out here in Minnesota, for example. But let's say you have a bunch of extra particles in Colorado. You've got a forest fire going, and you've got anthropogenic vehicle traffic. You got a lot of extra particles. So that same amount of water vapor has to spread across many more particles, and they don't grow large enough to actually drop out of the sky. And so that moisture is now not going to fall in Minnesota. It's going to go out into the Great Lakes, and then rain out in Pennsylvania or something like that. And so having the types of particles and the amount of particles that you have upwind of your location will determine how much precipitation, how much moisture you're going to get. So if you think about that in terms of wildfires here in Minnesota, Canadian wildfires are putting a lot more particles into the atmosphere coming across Minnesota, and we know that there's a lot of particles there. You can see when you can't see the downtown skyline. And the water vapor that was in the air is just spread across way too many particles now, and it's not going to rain out. So Canadian wildfires might lead to more and more drought in Minnesota here. The soil that gets released from these fires is, I know this has been studied. I've been reading some papers, and when I went to the Tri-Societies meeting, went to a fair number of talks about this, but soil carbon definitely gets released when you have a fire. From the atmosphere side, we're mostly focused on the grasses and trees and biomass that was burning. But there's more and more work being done now to think about, we know that changes the properties of the soil. But also this gets distributed in the atmosphere under different range of gases and particles, depending on what the fire type was like. So there's a lot more research that needs to be done. And it really can't be done in the lab because so far the lab and field work is just very different. The results are looking very different. So being out in the real environment and seeing, the temperature of the soil actually, matters so much in terms of what it's going to deliver to the atmosphere. So that's detrimental, of course, for carbon storage, and it's detrimental on the atmosphere side of things as well. This was just a snapshot of a carbon stock database for soil organic carbon. So we're at a very important area here on the border of all these fires happening just north of us and anything around Minnesota. This will be an important question that I'd be interested to continue to get involved with. Those fires coming into urban areas mix with urban pollutants and cause very different chemistry, very different reactive chemistry. And this is a whole area of funding in atmospheric sciences that I think could be interesting to collaborate on. Those particles also, those smoke particles come indoors. And so one area of my research has been indoor air chemistry over the last few years. And it's interesting, ignore all the details of the slide for a moment. It's similar to smoking cigarettes in a home. There's a lot of the same volatility of chemicals exist in biomass burning particles exist in tobacco smoke particles. And so when those particles come in the indoor environment, you can't just clean them with an air filter or open your windows. These stick onto all your surfaces, and they off gas for weeks to even years in some cases. So this is just kind of showing those particles coming in, and they can release these semi-volatile gases in minutes to hours. But then if you're in a surface film, on any of the films around, it could be a painted wall or the floor or the ceiling, whatever, the equilibration time to get those compounds back off there again could be a month to years. And so when we think about our exposure to wildfires, if that smoke gets into your house, you're not just exposed until that air mass blows through. You're going to continue to be exposed to those chemicals for months after that. This was my example of indoor to outdoor comparisons for semi-volatile compounds coming on and off of particles. So I gave a talk at National Academy of Sciences this year, and I decided to show stick figures for my National Academy talk. So this was a particle with these little semi-volatile stick figures jumping on and off of it. So in the atmosphere, they find some happy equilibrium. There's some radiation and oxidant interaction. So that's what the outdoors looks like to a particle. This is what the indoors world looks like to a particle, because you have tons and tons of surface area, and there are semi-volatile compounds on all of those surfaces. So as this particle comes flying through, it disturbs that equilibrium. Some things, hop on, and other things are just kind of along for the ride. So bringing particles in and out of the indoor environment will also disturb what's coming off those surfaces. So if you cook you had a wildfire come through and you had all that smoke come into your house, and then the next day, it's cleared out, but then you cook food and you put a bunch of particles out into the room. Your walls start releasing all those wildfire chemicals onto your food cooking particles, and you increase your exposure to those previous pollutants that were in the environment. Okay, so that's the summary of the fire stuff. These I'm going to skip through fairly fast, but I'm interested in general. Soil, wind-blown dust, and thinking about that for erosion purposes. There's a lot of work that's done on basically marking particles and trying to follow their elemental composition to identify where exactly they came from, what desert or what soil region they came from, because they preserve a lot of their mineral and elemental composition. Yeah, that's kind of basically what I said. You can also include different molecular organic compounds as markers to also identify some of the non-dust fraction as well. If you're interested to differentiate, if you're interested in wind-blown dust and you put a sampler out in the field and you look at the mass that was deposited, well, not all those particles came from wind-blown erosion. So you could use other chemicals to kind of differentiate the part that was not dust, for example. The other thing about wind is kind of think about primary spray drift of agrochemicals. And then also we've done a lot of work on looking at the volatilization of agrochemicals. And so Professor Griffiths has done some of this work on these similar chemicals. One of our focus areas was actually looking at for things like dicamba, for example. It's a very volatile chemical and it doesn't make a lot of sense to just spray it on your field. And so they use these different formulations to try to suppress the vapor pressure, the volatility of that dicamba, so it'll stay in place on the field. But under different conditions, soil conditions and leaf surface conditions, pH can change, and the amines in the formulation that were suppressing this can actually be released to the atmosphere, which also means that the dicamba can then be released as well. But now you have all these extra pollutants in the atmosphere that can impact a lot of the environmental exposure to other types of chemicals that were never intended to be released and had no purpose really other than volatility suppression to be in the field in the first place. So you can make a lot of new particle formation with those chemicals that are being released. This idea of environmental forensics, we use a lot of mass spectrometers for our research, and so it's interesting to, you can take these particles and gases and look at the mixtures and interpret where they come from based on looking at known sources one at a time. You can identify where they came from. So my quick way of showing this is, here's three different. In this case, I was talking about particles. So these were particles that are carrying different chemical composition with them based on where they came from, and identifiers. And so what we do with our mass spectrometry tools to determine what their sources might be is we do a little bit of environmental forensics here and put them on the operating table and go through their things and figure out what chemicals they're carrying with them to see where they came from. Your discretion advised here. We do this with many particles, bulk samples of particles, so that we get really large chemical signatures to see, on average, how many particles were coming from vehicle exhaust or from agriculture emissions. This is an example of we use various gas chromatography mass spectrometry techniques to determine where these are coming from, or what types of transformations these particles and gases have been experienced in the atmosphere. So these different, we take the instrument to the field and we look how these chemicals co-vary over time. Things that are associated with vehicle emissions will all go up and down together over time. For example, with rush hour traffic. We built this tool. Dylan Malay knows this quite well, but we built this tool in Berkeley, California. Started building this as a grad student, and we did sampling in the industrial district at night, and then we did sampling on campus in the morning. And our night samples from the industrial area were high in cannabinol. What were some of the other ones? Cocaine. We had methamphetamines. It was quite a mix, quite a cocktail. In the industry district or warehouse district at night, and then at morning on campus, the largest compound that showed up every single morning was caffeine. That was like off the charts, off of here. So that's how you use it for source identification. You can find natural or anthropogenic sources. You can look at fate and impact of these things. And a lot of the tools that are here already with some of the investigators, and then the tools that I'm going to be bringing, will be really good for various interdisciplinary collaborations. Looking at a lot of using these molecular markers to understand things about processes. And the last thing I'm going to say is I have a high interest in putting together a mobile laboratory. And I would love for that to be a very collaborative, interdisciplinary resource that we use as a department. I think it could be used for research, of course, but also teaching activities and outreach activities. You can pull up into a schoolyard and analyze samples with the class of students. Extension applications for this. You could do rural deployment, urban deployment, and we could build this in a way basically where equipment could roll in and out based on who was using it, what the project is, and what the needs are in the mobile lab facility. So one option is I've been looking at is having like an electric vehicle that would be something like this. Kind of size, and we would equip it with for atmospheric purposes and other purposes. There would be storage for equipment up here, but then you could basically have like shelving units that slide in and out in the back to put different equipment in. I have a smaller version of this. I converted my old Prius hybrid to a vehicle that could take some of my equipment around right now, and I just run all the power off of the high voltage battery. This is all stuff I did off campus, so that they didn't flag me for not being a licensed electrician. But this is probably the more likely option, but I just want to throw this out there and get a feel from the community. This is another option. There's more space. I don't know if we could get this in an electric version, but that looks a lot more fun. So we'll see how that develops. But I think that'd be a cool resource to use for research, teaching, extension. So that's kind of what I have, and I've gone a little bit over time. So if you have to leave, feel free to leave, but happy to discuss. Yeah, any thoughts or questions for those of you staying?
Option 2 would definitely get people's attention.
Yeah. Yeah, that might help Rachel's job with advertising. And yeah, that's right. Rachel has art background, so she could lead that effort. Yeah.
I like the mobile lab idea. I'm curious. I mean, first of all, I'd say if you're looking careful, probably about pulling up an unmarked van if it's still there.
Yeah, we'll want to make sure it's labeled.
But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how to pursue sort of funding to create.
Yeah, so there's a couple, and I guess I'll add. So the question is, mobile laboratory idea, how to fund a project like that. And actually, I think there's two parts. There's the how do you fund it initially to acquire, and then how do you maintain. So for those of you that have permanent field stations that are basically a sitting version of this, that becomes a challenge to continue to maintain and support that resource. So those are probably two different things, or an extension off of that first thing. I think the way to start probably is to, I mean, it's something I'll share with you that it's something I'd be interested in using some of my startup funds to contribute towards, to get off the ground that part. But it's also a fairly appealing thing for a lot of the interdisciplinary collaborative type projects that are out there right now. For example, I have a DOE project in Chicago Illinois with Argonne National Lab. And we put this in the budget for that project to acquire it and maintain it for, I think, 5 years, something like that. And it was a very small amount of that overall project budget, and it was, you know, it was approved just fine. If you write a proposal just for this, sometimes I haven't had success with getting those funded. But I think if you do it as part of a big collaborative project, you're more likely to get it. You still have the problem, okay, after 5 years, what's next? But I think once that resource is there, others can be writing that into their proposals, knowing that that would be a cool opportunity to, maybe that enables the ability to get different types of funding that we wouldn't have had before otherwise. Yeah. All right, well, maybe we'll have a vote in terms of option 1 or option 2 down the road when it gets closer. So, all right, well, thanks so much, everybody, for your time and for staying on.